Welcome. My name's Jim Steele. I'm an ecologist, and I spent 25 years in the Sierra Nevadas on the Tahoe National Forest as San Francisco State University's director of the Sierra Nevada Field Campus. For over 30 years, I've been studying how the ecosystems and the wildlife can be affected by regional climate change, by landscape changes, and changes in wildfires. And I think my insights from that long experience should provide some interesting ideas on how we can best deal with the devastations of the wildfires affecting the western United States. It's clear that wildfires have been an occurrence in California ongoing for thousands and thousands of years and will continue to be an integral part of California's ecosystems. The majority of plants have a wide variety of adaptations to deal with its ongoing effect of wildfires. And now we humans must also adapt. There's a wealth of scientific studies that show us how we can best adapt to wildfires and what are the causes. But that knowledge is being obscured by social media and some government officials that want to make the wildfires a crisis of the climate change crisis. And that's simply a false narrative. The Harvard Business Review explained why this hype would happen by writing a story in 1994 saying, journalists need crises to dramatize the news. And I think that's a point that's even more valid now in the age of the internet. And government officials need to appear to be responding to crises. So it's no surprise that we would see headlines from national public radio saying that climate change is causing deadly weather events. Or the New York Times says heat waves, floods, wildfires. We all know it's due to climate change. And then right on cue, you have the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change warn us that it's code red for humanity. None of this makes sense if you understand the ecology. And so I agree with Dilbert. It just doesn't make sense. For people living in fire-prone areas, there's a very simple adaptation. Create a defensible space. Now, fire-prone landscapes have very dense vegetation. The vegetation is well connected, creating a pathway that can carry the fire right to your house. To create fire-resistant landscapes, you want to have your vegetation in clumps so the fire can be slowed down trying to move from one clump to another. You slow down that pathway also by limiting ground fuels, which are known to carry fire the fastest. You want to prevent understory growth that allow the flames to reach into the canopy, create more embers that can carry the fire far and wide. And we know by experience the spacing is very important. If you have a campfire that's small, you can sit very close to the fire before the heat becomes unbearable. But if you have a large fire, a bonfire, you have to sit back at a much greater distance so the heat is not so unbearable. The Camp Fire, which devastated the town of Paradise, California, is an example of how too close a spacing can cause devastating results. As you see here, lot after lot of closely spaced houses were burnt completely to the ground, even though the trees around it survived perfectly. The needles on the trees were not even burnt. But once the ground fuels brought fire to one house, the heat built up so intensely like a bonfire that it ignited the house next to it, and house after house was reduced to ashes. Now I want to step back to when I was 14 years old, when I really first started to understand and appreciate the critical dynamics that lead to a fire. I was, as a Boy Scout, was given the task to set a survival fire. And I was dropped off in the woods of Maine. The temperature was about freezing. There was a foot of snow on the ground, and I was given a matchbook with just one match. So how do you create a fire under those conditions? Well, the first thing I realized I had to do, or I was taught to do, was you look for what we call the 1 hour fuels. They're very small diameter fuels that can be little twigs, leaves, pine needles, and grasses. And those they easily dry out in 1 hour. They lose 60% of their moisture under dry conditions. That they're small enough that just a little bit of heat from one match can ignite them. And that is your key starting point for every fire. Now, because they're so small, they don't have a lot of mass to produce a lot of energy. So they have to quickly pass that heat on and ignite something slightly bigger and slightly bigger. And you have to be careful of the size of the wood that you put on top of this little fire that you started. If I chose, say, to put a log on top of this, the fire would go out. The log has too much mass. It would take too much heat to ignite it. And so all the heat coming from these 1 hour fuels would be extinguished. So you have different levels of what we might call 10-hour fuels that are able to be, they're small enough to be ignited. They're small enough that they've probably dried out well if they're in the air. And this is the kindling of all wildfires. And if you listen to what any of the fire experts do when they're predicting a red flag warming, a key estimate before they give the warming is to assess the degree and the abundance of these 1 hour and these 10-hour fuels. And that's what's going to tell them how quickly the fire can be ignited and how quickly it can spread. Now, the same scientific knowledge that tells us how to build a defensible space and minimize the spread of fire can be applied to understanding why the western United States is experiencing some very huge megafires. We have good photographic evidence from back in the 1900s. If we see here at the Lewis and Clark National Forest in 1909, the hillsides in the foreground have very little trees. The vegetation is not very dense. In the background, in the hills to the left, we see there's a number of open patches. So we have these chunks of vegetation that are separated by bigger spaces, creating this mosaic that is fire resistant. By 1979, due to fire exclusion, the forests have come back and they've created a dense vegetation. They've eliminated most of the mosaics, and now you have set the stage to have tremendous megafires. If we compare the conditions in a Ponderosa fire forest in the Bitterroot National Forest in 1909, we see the ground fuels are mostly low grasses. They would spread very quickly and don't have enough energy to kill the trees or ignite the trees. They're not tall enough to bring fire into the canopy. But then by 1980, due to fire exclusion, we see the understory is now filled with shrubs and small trees. Now you have more fuel that can burn hotter and damage more trees. You have ladder fuels that can carry the fire up into the canopy and enhance the ability for embers to spread and cause spot fires that might start a mile away. So here we can see a ponderosa forest that's being well managed by keeping the ground fuels low, allowing frequent fires to happen and keep it clean. And it looks almost like a park. You can walk through it, and the trees look very healthy. Now, the importance of frequent ground fires that minimize the amount of fuel on the ground can be seen in these pictures that we often see of bears climbing trees to get away from a fire. Some time ago, I used to think that, gee, that was very stupid. A fire just climbs up the tree and kills the bear. He's got no place to run. But if it makes sense that when a bear cannot outrun a fire, it climbs a tree. And this behavior would evolve in conditions where fast-moving, low-intensity ground fires swept through the land. If you climb the tree, the fire moves past you in a matter of minutes, and there's never enough intensity to burn you, and then when the fire's gone, you can climb back down again. Now, we can put the current wildfire experience into a proper perspective by looking at fire history in different places across the United States. Looking at the Oregon Department of Forestry's history of fire dating back to 1911, we see in the 1930s there was a tremendous number of fires that created very large burnt areas. And we can also see that those large burnt areas are correlated with drought years. The orange bars represent drought years, the yellow bars not drought years. We also see after the 30s, there was a tremendous drop-off in the number of fires. And now, in the last 2 decades, we start to see an uptick in fires. And the large burnt areas again seem to be correlated with years that have drought. Now, looking at tree rings and burn scars and charcoal deposits, we can look at the fire history in the Southwest over the last 300 years. And we can see there was many more fires, much more frequent up to 1900. And then there was a drop-off. The drop-off seemed to happen here a little bit earlier than it happened in Oregon. So, again, we can't tell the exact cause, but we can see the last 100 years, there's been a drop-off in fires, which is going to tell you that there's going to be an accumulation of ground fuels that could be dangerous in our current time. The U.S. Forest Service was established to secure a bountiful harvest of lumber, and wildfires could reduce that harvest. So in 1935, the U.S. Forest Service started to rigidly enforce what they called the 10 a.m. policy. That meant that if you spotted a fire on day 1, that you put that fire out by day 2 by 10 a.m. in the morning. And this fire suppression stopped the large extent of fires that we've seen. And this correlates very well with the Oregon data that all of a sudden after the 1930s, there's a very period of low burnt areas. Now, when the media reports a wildfire, I think more often than not, the public assumes that it's a forest fire. But if we look at the data that shows what areas are burnt the most, and we break it down by habitat, we see that grasslands have the greatest extent of burnt area. That's followed by shrublands, and then the least amount is woodlands. And in part, this makes sense because grasslands and shrublands are the 1 hour and 10 hour fuels that are easily ignited and quickly spread a fire. Woodlands are bigger trees that are more resistant to fire. What we also see from this data is after 1940, all 3 habitats tend to have a drop-off in fires. And that, again, sort of correlates with the Forest Service 10 a.m. policy of fire suppression. Now, one caveat with this is data from CAL FIRE, which covers the regions in California that are at the lower elevations and have fewer forests and more grassland and shrubland. Forest Service data is going to have a greater percentage of forests that they govern. Now, in addition to humans actively suppressing fires, that they indirectly suppress fires by overgrazing. Overgrazing was becoming a huge problem across the West, and John Muir was one of the people leading the opposition to overgrazing, especially in Yosemite. He referred to the sheep as hoofed locusts because they would totally denude a pasture. That there was a plan to house 50,000 sheep pasture room in Yosemite Valley, and partly due to Muir's opposition, Yosemite became a national park to prevent this kind of overgrazing. But overgrazing was still happening across the West. The sheep were removing the 1 hour fuels that could cause larger grassland fires, which could spread to shrublands and could spread to forests. And so this overgrazing correlates well with the data we see, say, in the Southwest, where the large fires that we'd seen for hundreds of years now dropped off by the late 1800s. Now, not only should we discriminate between fires that happen in grasslands versus shrublands versus forests, we should do a little more fine-tuning and discriminate or differentiate between the amount of fires that happen in perennial grasslands versus invasive annual grasslands. And in California, at one time, the grasslands were dominated but were called perennial bunch grasses. They had more space between them, and you can get a sense of that spacing here by looking at the previous year's dead growth. You can see there were all the spaces in between their bunches. And the other thing with perennial grasses is they had deeper roots. They would germinate a little later in the season, but their roots were deep enough so they could pull moisture that had sunk deeper into the ground. And therefore, they could stay greener for longer and be more fire resistant until the new rains came in the next year. Now, in contrast to perennial bunch grasses, alien annual grasses have a much different effect on wildfire behavior. As the era of overgrazing started to denude some of the perennial grasses, they also introduced Eurasian grasses like cheatgrass. Now, cheatgrass has its name because it germinates much earlier in the winter. It has very shallow roots, so it can absorb most of the moisture in the surface soil. And by doing that, it inhibits any kinds of seeds that would germinate later in the season, like perennial grasses. As annual grasses, they grow quickly. They go to seed, spread their seed, and then die. And they're usually dead by May. So by the end of May, these annual grasses have dried out and become highly flammable 1-hour fuels. And by this early dryness of these grasses, you've now extended the fire season by a number of months compared to what perennial grasses would have caused. Now, most of the western United States is arid, and a lot of this arid regions are dominated by sagebrush ecosystems. And sagebrush ecosystems do not produce a lot of ground fuels because it's so arid, and so you have these nice spacing in between the sagebrushes, and because of that spacing, sagebrush habitat experiences fires only every 60 to 100 years. But soon, the invasive cheatgrasses filled in those spaces. And now, wherever cheatgrass dominates, sagebrush has experienced fires every 3 to 5 years. And this has been of great concern to ornithologists who are trying to protect the sage grouse because their habitat is dependent on sagebrush. Now, the sage grouse mating system is pretty fascinating. They have a lecking ground, which is sort of a community dance hall. And the males come and they puff up their chests and they strut around. And you see 3 of them here on the right. And the females watch and see who's the best dancer. And whoever turns them on, they go give them a little peck and they go off and they mate. And these lecking grounds in the sagebrush, though, are coming under greater and greater threats. The invasive grasses are now filling in the spaces between the sagebrush. And it's causing fires to happen more frequently. And in the last 20 years, 11 of the United States' 50 biggest fires, this 20%, happen in Great Basin sagebrush. Now, 30 years ago, some prominent ecologists from Stanford and UC Berkeley, they coined the phrase the grass fire cycle. And what it says is you have a fire, it allows more of these grasses to take over. And then when these grasses take over, they allow more fire. And so you get a conversion of landscape to more and more of these annual invasive grasses this way. And so here you see these swaths of annual invasive grasslands that provide a pathway to burn the shrubbery and burn the trees in a much greater and more rapid way than had been done before. Now, it's these swaths of invasive grasses that characterize the Golden Hills of California that are now so extensive. And it just takes a spark to set these grasslands on fire. The Mendocino Complex Fire was the second greatest fire until the Dixie Fire has just replaced it, moved it to third. A farmer was driving a stake into the ground. It hit a rock, caused a spark, and ignited the grasslands, which spread across the landscape. The Carr Fire, top 10 fire in California, up by Redding, California. A car was towing a trailer. It blew a tire. The rim scraped the asphalt, set a spark that sparked the grasses on the side of the road, and that spread into Nevada. And you had the Camp Fire, which was just an electrical grid spark, set that fire to become the deadliest fire in California. Now, I've explained a lot of these dynamics to friends who cling to this idea that global climate crisis is causing these fires. And their argument is, well, warming is causing a drier landscape. It's making it less humid. In one way, that contradicts the theory that more evaporation should make the air more humid. But grasses can make the local landscape much drier than what global warming has done. And to give you a sense of why this is true, here's an illustration of the global water cycle. And what you see here is that most of the moisture that enters the air is due to evaporation from the oceans. And here they give it a number of 485, the units is gigatons, and we don't need to think about that right now. As that rises, it cools and the water falls back to the ocean. So most of the water that evaporates goes back to the ocean. But some of that water, a portion, 40, less than 10%, gets transported over to the land. And so that's what keeps all our landscapes as moist as they are. But the curious thing is, even though only 40 gigatons gets transported, we record precipitation approximating 3 times that, 111 gigatons. Well, how does that happen? Well, it has to do with recycling that rainwater. And the key component to this recycling is vegetation. You have trees and grasses that pull the water from the soil, bring it back to the air through transpiration, and then it falls again as precipitation. If you have dead grasses, if your landscape is taken over by grasses that are dead in May, then your summer is going to get much less humid because of the lack of vegetation. Now, in addition to the drying effect of these dead grasses, once they're ignited, these grass fires spread with temperatures that are about 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. And that easily dries and ignites the vegetation that it reaches. And that makes this 2 degrees of global warming seem very insignificant in comparison. Now, the studies that compare changes in temperature into the likelihood of a grass fire find absolutely no correlation. And that makes sense because 1-hour fuels can be very dry at freezing temperatures like I experienced in my survival fire to 90 degrees temperature or higher. It's the dryness and the quickness that these 1-hour and 10-hour fuels can become highly flammable that's important. If we look at the United States, where are the most fires? We clearly see it's in the dry western United States, and those dark brown areas show where the fires have been the most active. If we look at other correlation to the right of where cheatgrass is invaded and become most abundant, we see that the abundance of cheatgrass is probably the best correlation to the most active fire problems in the western United States. So let me summarize the problems with invasive grasses related to wildfires, because the mass media right now rarely talks about this issue. Instead, they like to push a climate crisis. But there's a huge effect here. Number one, invasive annual grasses, they germinate in the winter. And by doing that, they're able to outcompete the perennial grasses, they dry the soil, and they're able to increasingly spread their abundance across the landscape. These invasive annual grasses provide the 1-hour dead fuels, and those fuels are most easily ignitable, and so you get more fires. Invasive annual grasses connect mosaic landscapes, and so when you have that connection, you can have a fire spread to a much greater area, much greater extent. And then finally, because invasive annual grasses germinate and die earlier in the season than the perennial grasses, they extend the fire season by months. Now, the wildfire crisis is not a global warming crisis. It's a crisis that happens very regionally. The western United States more than the eastern United States. And California has the most prone landscape to fires because it suffers a Mediterranean climate. And by that I mean Mediterranean climates have mild, wet winters, but they have very dry and warm summers. And it rarely rains between June and October. Rare rainfall in June or October, in between virtually no rainfall whatsoever. And if you see where this happens, these Mediterranean climates are almost completely found at 40 degrees north latitude on the west coast of continents. And if we look over at Europe, we'll see in the Mediterranean, it's on the west coast of the Eurasia continent, right at the same latitude. And this year, Greece, Turkey, they're also experiencing many fires because they're prone to it. And there's other issues with arson. If you look south of the equator, we see a very symmetrical response. In Chile, you have a Mediterranean climate. At 40 degrees south, you have something similar in Australia on the west coast. You don't see these happen on the east coast. And to explain that, I'm going to have to quickly delve into some atmospheric circulation science. In the simplest terms, we have something called the Hadley circulation. At the equator, the sun's energy is the strongest. It heats the surface and causes this warm, moist air to rise. As that air rises, it cools, and the water vapor condenses and falls back as precipitation, causing the rainforest. And now the rest of the air, 99% of the air, is now dry. But that air has to come down someplace. And it has to come down someplace where it's a little bit cooler, where rising air can't prevent it from doing so. And so around 20, 30 degrees north and south, this air sinks. And it causes two issues. One, there's this very symmetrical pattern of deserts on either side of the equator, and it forms high pressure systems that are placed very symmetrically. And these are quasi-permanent symmetrical high pressure systems. And these high pressure systems, they cause the atmosphere to circulate in a clockwise formation. And so you see here in the Pacific, this clockwise formation takes any of the moisture and rain and storms that are headed towards the west coast and deflects them up towards Alaska and Washington. So you have more like boreal rainforests up in that region, while California is completely denied its summer rainfall, which gives us this Mediterranean climate. In the Atlantic, the same clockwise rotation drives moisture into the eastern United States. So we see the eastern United States is far wetter and has far fewer fires just because of this sort of arrangement symmetrically around the world. Another way to look at how these high pressure systems are transporting moisture to the continent is to look at a map of the United States average relative humidity. And we see on the east side of the United States, it's very green, it's very moist. The closer the land is to the ocean, the greater the moisture. When you get to the west, it becomes very dry. And in the interior west is going to be the driest. On the west coast, you do have some high humidity as the land heats up. It draws in the fog and its moisture, and so you have high humidity there. And plants like the redwood forest have adapted to surviving off of that fog. Now, the high pressure systems that control the flow of moisture are quasi-permanent, meaning they can get a little stronger, a little weaker. It slightly move north or south or east or west. Now, there are two ways you can change the strength of those pressure systems. One way is to change the surface temperature seasonally. During the summer, the coast of the Pacific Ocean becomes colder relative to the warmer inland. And so then the high pressure systems become stronger and prevent more water from reaching the coast, which is why California has its very dry Mediterranean climate during the summer. During the winter, when the oceans are warmer than the colder interior of the coast, then the high pressure systems weaken, and that allows more moisture to flow, and so we have a mild, wet winter. Now, the other way to cause a change is due to the El Nino cycles. Now, during an El Nino, warm water flows from Australia and Indonesia and flows over to the coast of the Americas. It warms the surface, it weakens the high pressure, and that's the time we get our most rain and the heaviest flood rains. At the same time, instead of water going to the up the coast, it's gone to the Americas. So the lack of warming water reaching the eastern coast of Asia, that area of the Pacific becomes much cooler. So you have this dipole of temperatures across the Pacific Ocean. That condition changes, which is called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. After about 20 to 30 years, the warm water that has been forming in the eastern part of the Pacific is dissipated. And now the trade winds can carry more warm water up the coast of Asia, so the Northwest Pacific becomes a lot warmer. At the same time, the trade winds enhance more upwelling, which brings colder, deeper water to the surface, so this part of the Pacific becomes much colder. And by becoming much colder, the high pressure systems become stronger and prevent more moisture from reaching the United States or California. And so it's during La Niñas, it's during the cold negative Pacific Decadal Oscillation that the western United States experiences its most drought. Now, another way to understand the effects of El Niños and La Niñas in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is to look at how precipitation in California has oscillated over the last 120 years. And from this data, in this study, we can see that we have periods where we have, on average, greater precipitation, and then 20 to 30 years where, on average, there's less precipitation. But even within those times, we can see an El Nino will spike the wetness and a La Nina will cause more dryness, even though on average it's a much wetter time. Now, just to clarify a little bit about these critical dynamics, you can have an El Nino or a La Nina during the cold phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. But maybe 29% of the time, you're going to have a cold Pacific Decadal Oscillation and a cold La Nina increase the high pressure and block the flow of moisture, causing more drought and bigger fires. And that's just what they found in 70% of the large fires in the Rocky Mountains National Park since the 1700s. They happened when you had this co-occurrence of a La Nina and a negative Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So it's a legitimate question to ask, has climate change increased the amount of droughts? Because there's some researchers that like to claim that. So one of the best ways to look at it is we've looked at tree ring data for the blue oaks that are very sensitive to precipitation. They're found along the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And if we look at what the tree rings tell us for the last 700 years and compare it to the drought we had in 2012, 2014, which were La Nina years, this blue dashed line shows us how much below average the precipitation was. And if you look carefully, it looks like every 3 to 4 times a century that we have very dry conditions that are very similar or actually exceeded what happened in 2012, 2014. So as of now, that does not look like the change in climate has caused any kind of change in the precipitation and in the drought along California. Well, I have some people that have drunk the Kool-Aid of the New York Times type narratives. They'll argue, well, of course you can have changes in precipitation and that might not have changed, but global warming has caused more heat waves that make droughts even worse. But again, if we look at the data, that just is not true. The EPA heat wave index here shows that the worst heat waves happened in the 1930s. And that was the way the ocean surfaces had become a little cooler. And you confounded that problem with ripping up the grasslands that would have the vegetation and make it more humid. And without moisture, the same amount of energy makes temperature go much higher. And so you see this huge peak in heat waves in the 1930s. And you don't see anything approaching that ever since. We see a mild uptick since the 70s, but that's partly because of the way these ocean oscillations have changed. Now, the U.S. Forest Service has kept track of how much area has burned since 1926. And if we can see here by that data, in the 1930s, during that kind of 1930s drought, we see some of the worst extent to the amount of forest fires that happened then. But then it declined. And as we mentioned before, it could be partly due to fire suppression that started in 1935 and extensive grazing. So the suppression policy started to loosen up by 1970, and that's when we start to see a slight uptick in fires. But we also see it's a time of the negative Pacific Decadal Oscillation switch for the last 20 years. So it seems a combination of less suppression of fires and a drier climate due to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation has caused this small uptick, but it's still not even approaching 20% of what we were seeing back in the 1930s. Now, it's also bad science to use a global average temperature and suggest that's what dried up a local habitat. You have to look at the local regional habitats. And if you look at the data on warming in the United States, 36% of the long-term weather stations with data over 70 years have exhibited cooling periods. So there's no way warming could have caused an increase in fire in those around those locations. So if we look at the Mendocino Complex fire, which was the second biggest, has now been passed by the Dixie Fire, so it's now the third biggest in California. One of the closest stations to where it started, whether it's in Ukiah, California, and we see in the 1930s was the warmest maximum temperatures. And then since then, it's been cooling. So what we see now when the fire happened recently, it's in 2016, 2018, you can't blame it on global warming. If you look at the temperatures that recorded in Chico, which is right near to Paradise, where the Camp Fire was the deadliest fire in California, we see something similar, but not quite. The 1930s, again, the highest temperatures. They declined. It's come back a little bit, but it still hasn't superseded what we saw in the 1930s. Now, we must also examine how human ignitions have changed fire behavior in the last century. And it's been shown that 84% of the fires started in the United States have been caused by human ignitions. California is very susceptible to this because the amount of people has increased from 1.5 million in 1900 to over 39 million now. And when you have that many people increase, you're going to have more accidental fires, such as the Mendocino Complex fire. You're going to have more stupid fires, as the Rim fire, where a campfire escaped. And you're going to have more ignitions due to power grids, as you had in the Paradise fire. The biggest problem with human ignitions is it extends the fire season. The peak of fire season for natural cause fires from lightning happens in July and August, and then it drops off dramatically before and after those two peaks. What human ignitions has done is increase the number of ignitions that happen on the shoulder seasons, when the seasons are much colder than the summer. And that is important because if you ignite a fire during those seasons, you're exposing that fire to ferocious winds known as the Santa Ana or the Diablo winds, which blow strongest in cold weather. So why would cold weather cause more fires, bigger fires? Well, the answer is in the high mountain deserts, as it gets colder, you have a higher pressure system develop, and the ocean remains warmer with a lower pressure. And that pressure difference pushes the dry winds out of the desert down towards the ocean. It reverses the flow that was happening during the summer. And that creates these powerful Santa Ana winds or Diablo winds. They'll travel down different valleys, so certain places become more vulnerable to fires. And as the winds descend from the mountains, they warm by 5 degrees for every 1,000 feet it descends due to the increasing pressure. And so we get these dry winds that just make the fires expand to a much greater extent than you would have during the summer. Now, the Camp Fire was California's deadliest fire and devastated the town of Paradise. And people naturally want to know, could we have prevented this kind of catastrophe? If we look in hindsight, we can see in this region that there had been accumulation of ground fuels, likely due to fire suppression. We know the fire was ignited by an electrical spark, so better care of our electrical system could have helped prevent the fire. And we also know that some of the devastation happened because house after house ignited because they were too closely spaced. So all those things are things that we could have prevented and lessen the devastation, at least to some degree. And what we see is Stephen Pine is a fire historian. And what he said about the way we've dealt with fires is saying that global warming has furnished a political cover to encourage management decisions while allowing climate to take the blame. So I want to conclude with some remedies that I can imagine are very manageable and very doable, and actually help us adapt to wildfires. And I also want to say that the claims of the media and some government officials that preventing CO2, lowering emissions is going to stop wildfires is only going to mislead and misdirect our efforts. No matter what else you think about CO2 and what its effects, lowering CO2 emissions will not solve the wildfire problem. What we can do is, one, is manage the ground fuels. We can create these natural mosaics of fire breaks and minimize the spread of large megafires. We can manage invasive grasses. We can do prescribed burns before they set seed and spread native seed for perennial grasses. We can reduce human ignitions by securing our power grid, making sure the trees can't fall on a high power line or bury the power lines. And we can maintain defensible spaces throughout the West because Western wildfires are inevitable and we have to learn to live with them. So in closing, I want to emphasize bad analyses produce bad remedies. I also want to emphasize and encourage you to dive deep into the ecology of these wildfires because fear always springs from ignorance. And finally, in my more optimistic moments, I don't want to brag, but this is like the fifth end of the world scenario that I've survived. And I truly think we're going to be able to survive whatever crises the media tells us we're facing. Thank you.